Everett Moss thought he had built something that would last. He had run the Moss Mill in Harlan County, Kentucky for 22 years. 300 acres of timber rights, a sawmill that could cut 60,000 board feet in a good week, and a crew of 11 men who had worked for him so long. They called him by his first name and he called them by theirs. The mill had fed 3 generations of the same families in that hollow. It had survived a flood in 1891 and a fire in 1898 and a market crash in 1903. Everett had survived all of it the same way he survived everything, which was by keeping his head down, working harder than the men under him, and refusing to change the way his father had set the thing up in 1874. Then his dead wife's sister arrived in the spring of 1907 to collect what her sister had left behind. She looked at his books for 2 evenings, and on the 3rd morning she told him he was going to lose the mill by Christmas, if he kept running it the way he was running it. Everett told her she was welcome to take her sister's things and go back to Cincinnati. She stayed for 3 weeks. By the end of the 3rd week, Everett Moss understood that the woman who had come to take inventory of a dead woman's belongings had instead taken inventory of his entire operation, his entire life, and found the thing at the center of all of it that he had refused to look at for 6 years. She did not do it with cruelty. She did not do it with pity either, which would have been worse. She did it the way she did everything, which was with a pencil and a ledger and a kind of clear-eyed honesty that a proud man had no defense against. Because the numbers don't care how hard you worked. They only tell you what is true. Cora Vane was 34 years old when she came to Harlan County, and she had spent the better part of those years learning that most men confuse stubbornness with strength and called the difference character. Her father had been an accountant in Cincinnati. Her older sister Della had been the pretty one, the warm one, the one who could walk into a room and make everyone in it feel like the sun had come out. Cora was the one who sat in the corner at parties and added up the household accounts in her head, because she found numbers more honest than conversation. She had married once briefly, a man named Whitfield who turned out to prefer whiskey to responsibility, and she had unmarried herself from him with the same efficiency she applied to everything else. After the divorce she had gone to work for her father's firm and had discovered that she was very good at the kind of thinking most people found tedious. The patient, methodical work of finding where money went when no one was watching it. Della had married Everett Moss in 1897. Cora had met him twice, once at the wedding in Cincinnati, once at a Christmas gathering 2 years later, and had formed the impression of a man who was decent but sealed, the kind of man who kept his feelings behind his sternum like something locked in a strong box. Della had loved him for it, had told Cora once that Everett made her feel safe the way a good roof made you feel safe. Solid above you, between you and whatever the sky was planning. Della had died in 1901. Influenza, in February, the way influenza took the strong ones as often as the weak. She had left behind a husband who had not known how to grieve out loud, and a sister who had grieved quietly in Cincinnati for 6 years. While the mill went on running and Everett Moss went on surviving. The letter from the county clerk arrived in March. Della had left a small interest in the mill property to Cora, a gesture Everett had apparently agreed to years ago and forgotten about, or perhaps had never expected to matter. The clerk's letter was polite and procedural. There were papers to sign and personal effects to collect and a matter of the property interest to resolve. Cora's father read the letter and said what he always said in situations like this: never settle what you have not personally examined. So Cora packed a bag, sent a wire to Harlan County and boarded the train south. Everett Moss met her at the depot in a wagon that had seen better decades. He was 41 years old, and he looked it in the way that men who work outside look their age, weathered and deliberate, every line on his face earned. He shook her hand at the platform like she was a business associate, which she supposed she was, and said it was good of her to come all this way. He said it the way people say things they feel required to say. On the road to the mill, he told her the drive was about 9 miles, and that her sister's things had been kept exactly as they were. He said this last part carefully, like a man reporting something he considered important. Cora thanked him. They did not talk much after that. The mill came into view around a long bend in the creek, and Cora looked at it the way she looked at everything. Not with feeling first but with attention. She noted the age of the equipment visible from the road. She noted the state of the cut timber stacks. She noted that 3 of the 11 men she could see moving around the yard were not moving with any particular urgency. She did not say any of this. She helped herself down from the wagon, carried her own bag to the room Everett had set aside for her, and waited until he had gone back to the yard before she sat down on the edge of the bed and let herself feel, just for a moment, that she was in the house where her sister had lived and died, sleeping in a room that smelled faintly of cedar and old wallpaper, 1,000 miles from anything familiar. Then she stood up, washed her hands and face, and went looking for the account books. She found them in the office off the main room, on a shelf above the desk, 3 ledgers and a shoebox of receipts that had been sorted into approximate piles and then apparently left to settle. She lit the lamp, made herself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove, and she read. She read for most of that first evening and into the first night. By the time she heard Everett's boots on the porch, she had found enough to understand the shape of the problem. By the time she turned the lamp down to sleep, she had found enough to understand how serious it was. The mill was not failing dramatically. It was failing the way a good coat wears through. Slowly at the seams, in places you don't think to look until one day the cold gets in, and you realize the coat has been useless for years, and you just hadn't noticed because you kept your head down. There were 3 main holes. The first was the timber contracts. Everett was selling to 2 buyers he'd had since his father's time, at prices his father had negotiated in the 1880s. Prices that had not been renegotiated once in over 2 decades, while the market around them had moved considerably. He was leaving money on the table every single week without knowing it. The second hole was the equipment. 2 of the 3 main saws had not been properly serviced in 4 years. She found the maintenance records, or rather she found the absence of maintenance records. And she found the repair invoices that had been paid in the last 18 months. And understood that Everett was spending more money patching old machinery than it would cost him to replace one of the saws outright. The third hole was the thing she had not expected, and that changed everything about how she understood the rest. The mill owned the timber rights on 300 acres. But 200 of those acres were on the far side of Sutter Ridge, a 4-mile haul over roads that turned to mud for 5 months of the year. The timber from those acres cost twice as much to bring in as it earned. They had cost twice as much to bring in since the 1880s. It had simply never been examined. When Cora put it all together on the kitchen table the next morning, the picture that emerged was of a man who was working enormously hard to sustain losses that had been baked into the operation before he inherited it, who had never once stopped to ask whether the inherited terms still made sense, because the asking would have required looking at something he did not want to look at. She did not yet know what that something was. She had a suspicion, but she had learned a long time ago not to say the word before she had the figures. On the second morning she asked Everett to walk the property with her. He agreed in the way men agree to things they consider unnecessary but will allow to humor someone they feel responsible for. They walked for most of the day. Cora asked questions the whole time, not timber questions, not operations questions, money questions. What does this section of the ridge cost to run? What does it bring in? When did you last look at the Harrington contract rate against the current market? Everett could answer some of them and not others. The ones he could not answer he brushed past with a kind of practiced ease. The way a man steps around a hole in a floor he's been stepping around for so long he no longer sees it as a hole. He just knows to step there. That evening Cora laid it out on the kitchen table. She did not soften it, but she did not dramatize it either. She simply showed him what the numbers said. The 2 far ridge sections were costing him more every year than they produced. He was selling timber at 1887 rates in 1907. He was paying to repair a saw that had earned out its useful life 4 years ago. If nothing changed, she estimated he would be unable to make payroll by October, and would need to sell or borrow by the end of the year. Everett listened to all of it without expression. Then he said the first thing that told her something true about him. He said, "My father spent 12 years getting those ridge sections. He traded 3 good horses and his best hay acreage to consolidate that land. Those acres were the thing he was proudest of." Cora looked at him for a moment. She said, "I understand that. But your father logged those sections when the haul road was passable year-round. The road washed out in the flood of 1891 and was never rebuilt properly. The acres that made sense in 1885 are a different proposition in 1907. Everett said nothing. But he did not disagree, and that was something. On the third day she looked at the contracts more closely. What she found made her set her pencil down for a moment. The Harrington buyer, the larger of Everett's 2 main buyers, the one who took 60% of his cut lumber, had been sending invoices with a grading system that shorted Everett approximately 8 cents per 100 board feet. Not a dramatic discrepancy. Not the kind of thing you'd notice, unless you were looking for it. But 8 cents per 100 board feet, at 60,000 feet per week in a good season, added up to something considerable over a year. And over 12 years it added up to something that made Cora set her pencil down and look out the window for a moment before she picked it up again. She could not prove it was deliberate. She could prove it was systematic. When she showed it to Everett that evening he sat very still for a long time. Then he said, "John Harrington's father and my father shook hands on that arrangement in 1890. Cora said, "I know. And John Harrington has been running the same grading system since 1895. I cross-checked the invoices." Everett looked at the table. He said, "I've known John Harrington my whole life." Cora said, "I know you have. That's why he counted on you not to check." She did not say it with heat. She said it the way she said everything, plainly. Because the plain truth was kinder than a gentler version that left a man thinking he'd been treated fairly. Everett's jaw tightened. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the dark yard for a while. When he came back to the table, he sat down and said, Show me the rest. The fourth day was when she found the thing at the center of it. She had been going through the older ledgers, the ones from the years just before and after Della's death, looking for when the pattern of non-maintenance had started, when the contracts had last been renegotiated, when the ridge sections had last been evaluated. What she found instead was that in 1901 and 1902, someone had been making the books work by increments. Not fraud, not embezzlement. Just the small, daily optimism of a man who believed things would improve and kept adjusting the numbers to reflect what he hoped rather than what he had. After February of 1901, Everett had simply stopped looking at the books with anything like rigor. He had kept them, because a man keeps the books. But he had not looked at them. He had looked at them the way you look at a photograph of a person you have lost. You see it every day and eventually you stop seeing it. Because seeing it costs too much. Cora understood this immediately because she was her sister's sister and she had buried her sister too. She knew what it was to carry grief like freight. Not because it was heavy in any given moment, but because it was always there, shifting the weight of everything else. She closed the ledger from 1902, and sat for a while at the kitchen table in the early morning before Everett came in, and she allowed herself to think something she had not let herself think since she arrived. That the real accounting here was not about timber and board feet and contract rates. Those were symptoms. The real accounting was of a man who had lost the person who made sense of things, and who had responded to that loss by working harder and looking less. By filling the shape of a life with motion, so that the stillness couldn't get in. She had done something similar in Cincinnati with columns of numbers and other people's books. She recognized the method. She was not proud of recognizing it, but she recognized it. That evening, when Everett came in from the yard, she did not lay out a report. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him, and sat down across from him and said, "Can I ask you something that isn't about the mill?" He looked at her with the particular wariness of a man who has spent years keeping things in their appropriate categories. He said, "I suppose," she said. "When did you last take a day that wasn't about the work?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Della used to make me do that, take a Sunday, walk down to the creek. She said I'd go rigid if I didn't." He said it matter-of-factly like reporting the weather. Cora said, "She was right about most things." Everett said yes. And then because he was a man who kept things behind his sternum and the lid had been loosened by 4 days of someone seeing clearly what he had kept in the dark. He said, "She was the only person I ever knew who could tell me a hard thing and make me feel better for hearing it. Not because she softened it. She never softened things, she knew how to say what was true without making you feel stupid for not having seen it yourself." He stopped. He looked at his coffee. He said, "I couldn't look at the books after she died. Every number in those books, I knew who had written them, or been there when they were written. I couldn't." Cora sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "I know." I could see where the looking stopped. She did not say it to wound him. She said it so he would know she had seen it and was not judging it. Because grief is not a business failure. It is just the price of having loved something. And some prices look like neglect from the outside without being anything of the kind. On the 5th day, Everett stopped defending the old arrangements. It happened not with any particular declaration, but simply as a shift in how he listened. Less braced, less careful about what he let through. He sat with her at the table each morning and evening, and worked through the plan she had been building. The ridge sections could be sold. There was a coal company operating 15 miles east that had been acquiring land for years and would pay well for the acreage. Not for the timber but for the mineral rights underneath it. Cora had looked into it. The money from the sale would buy the new saw, renegotiate from a position of stability rather than desperation, and leave enough in reserve that a bad season wouldn't mean missed payroll. The Harrington contract needed to be renegotiated with the corrected grading system, or terminated and replaced. She had already identified 2 other buyers in the region. Neither of them were old family friends, which she noted was probably an advantage. Everett looked at the plan for a long time. He said, "My father would say I was giving up ground." Cora said, "Your father would say whatever your father would say. But the ground you're giving up is the ground that's been sinking under you for 20 years. There's no honor in defending land that's swallowing you." He was quiet. Then something shifted in his face. Not softened, exactly, but opened the way a window opens when a room has been closed too long. He said, "You sound like her sometimes." She had the same way of saying a thing that couldn't be argued with. Cora said, "She used to say she learned it from our father. I think she was born with it." Everett almost smiled. It was brief, but Cora saw it, and she understood that brief was probably a lot for him. On the 6th day, Cora was scheduled to leave. The work was finished. The plan was written out in 2 copies, one for each of them. Her business with the property interest had been resolved the previous evening. She had signed her share back to Everett at a fair valuation, and he had accepted it without argument. There was nothing left that required her to stay. She packed her bag and brought it to the front room and set it by the door. Everett was at the table with his coffee looking at the plan. He did not look up when she came in, which she was accustomed to. She poured her own coffee and sat down. They were quiet for a while. The comfortable quiet that had replaced the 40 miles of silence, quiet of the first day, which felt like it had been a long time ago. Then Everett said, without looking up from the plan, "The Burley crew is bringing in a section tomorrow. It'll take most of the week. If you stayed a few more days you could see whether the new grading process works on a real cut." Cora looked at her coffee. She said, "That's not why you're asking me to stay." He was quiet. He looked up from the plan. He said, "No, it isn't." Outside the creek was running with the spring melt, and somewhere down in the hollow one of the men was splitting wood, and the sound of it came up clear through the morning. Everett Moss, who was not a man who found words without difficulty, said the thing that was true. He said, "I have been in this house alone for 6 years. I worked through it because working was the only thing I knew how to do that didn't hurt. And then you came and sat down at my kitchen table with a lamp and a pencil, and you looked at everything I was afraid to look at, and you told me the truth about all of it. And the truth didn't feel like punishment. It felt like..." He stopped. He tried again. "It felt like what Della always said a good map was for. Not to tell you where you went wrong. To show you where you actually are so you can figure out where to go from here." Cora set down her coffee. She looked at this man, 41 years old, weathered and sealed and honest, in the way that very private people are honest, completely and without theater, and she thought about her father's rule, which had never failed her. Never settle what you have not personally examined. She had examined the timber rights and the contracts and the machinery and the books. She had examined the grief underneath the books, and the pride underneath the grief and the man underneath all of it, and she had found against her own expectations that the most sound thing on the entire property was not the good sawmill or the renegotiated contracts or the new plan laid out in 2 neat copies. It was a man who had kept all of his wife's things exactly as they were, not out of an inability to move forward, but out of a fidelity to what had mattered, the stubbornness that had been bleeding him in the ledger being the very same stubbornness that had kept him, in his own quiet way, faithful. That was something. It was, she had learned in 34 years of looking at what things were actually worth, a rarer thing than it looked. She said, "I'll stay through the Burley cut, after that we'll see." Everett nodded once, the way he agreed to things that were settled. He looked back at his plan. Cora poured herself a second cup of coffee. Outside the wood-splitting sound went on, and the creek went on, and the spring morning went on around them, unhurried. They were married in October, in a small ceremony at the mill property with 11 men from the crew and Cora's father, who came down from Cincinnati with his ledger case and his approval in that order. The county found it curious and said so in the way that small counties say things. The widow's sister. The closed-up millman. People assumed there was a story of convenience to it, a practical arrangement between 2 people who had run out of better options. They were wrong about that, but Cora did not explain it to them. She had long since stopped spending energy correcting people who did not read carefully. She ran the books, Everett ran the mill and the crew and the land. They sold the Far Ridge sections to the coal company in November for a sum that surprised Everett and did not surprise Cora. The new saw went in before Christmas. The Harrington contract was renegotiated in February, with the corrected grading rate, and John Harrington signed it, because the alternative Cora had arranged was better for Everett and John Harrington knew it. Within 2 years the Moss mill was cutting more efficiently on half the timber rights than it had ever managed on the full 300 acres. Other mill operators in the county came to look at what they were doing, and could not quite understand how a smaller operation was outperforming theirs. The answer was not complicated. Everett's wife could read a contract and she did. Every one of them, every year without exception. In 1912 a hard winter took 2 weeks off the cutting season, and there was a labor dispute in the eastern part of the county that slowed supply. 3 other mills in Harlan County cut their crews and 2 of them never fully recovered. The Moss mill did not cut its crew, because Cora had been building the reserve for exactly that kind of year. She knew what reserves were for because her father had told her when she was 9 years old and she had never forgotten it. A reserve is not savings. It is the distance between a hard year and a lost one. In 1919 Everett's health began to fail. He kept working as long as he could, which was longer than his doctor thought advisable, because he was who he was. When he could no longer work the yard, he sat in the office and told Cora things about the timber and the crew, and the land that he had carried in his head for 40 years, and had never written down, because the writing of them had always seemed like an admission that they might be needed without him. Cora wrote them down, everyone. She had always known that the knowledge in a man's head was the most undervalued asset in any operation, and she had always intended to put it somewhere it could not be lost. Everett Moss died in 1923 at the age of 57. Cora outlived him by 19 years and ran the mill herself for most of them, selling it in 1938 to a partnership that included their son and 2 men from the original crew's families, which is what she had always planned. She kept the books on it until the year she died. At 81, her handwriting in those ledgers was as clear as it had been at 34. She had always believed that clarity was a form of respect. For the work, for the people the work fed, and for the truth, which she had decided a long time ago was worth the trouble of looking at, even when, especially when, looking at it cost you something. She never remarried and never needed to. She had found what she was looking for in a coal country sawmill, in the spring of 1907. Not the thing she had come to collect, but something worth considerably more. Which was what tended to happen when you looked carefully at what was actually there instead of what you expected to find. I think about Everett Moss sometimes when I think about the things we run on habit and pride and the weight of inherited arrangements. The contracts we never renegotiate, the machinery we keep patching, the far acres we keep maintaining because someone we loved worked hard to acquire them, and it feels like betrayal to let them go. Most of us have something like that. Some part of our life we keep running the old way, because changing it would mean admitting that the old way wasn't working, and admitting that feels too close to saying the person who set it up was wrong, or that we were wrong to keep it going, or that the years we spent on it were wasted years. They weren't wasted, but sometimes the most honest thing you can do for the dead is look clearly at what they left you and make it work, even if making it work means making it different. Cora knew that. It was the thing she gave Everett, and it was worth more than any of the figures in any of the ledgers she ever kept. Tell me in the comments. What is the thing in your life you are still running on inherited terms? Because changing them feels like giving up something that was never really yours to hold. And if you want another story about a woman who saw clearly and a man who finally let himself be seen, the next one is already waiting for you.